This isn't a Bigfoot story. So if that's what you're looking for, move on. I only wish what I experienced that night was a giant, hairy bipedal ape. Maybe then I could rationalize it in my head that I'd only seen a bear and would be able to move on with my life. If only it were that simple. It was Thanksgiving break in the fall of '89. I was 19 years old and in my sophomore year at the University of Arkansas. All my friends were headed home for the week, but home didn't seem like an option for me right now. But that's not what this story's about. It'd been a particularly rough couple of months, and quite frankly, I wasn't in the Thanksgiving mood. The thought of being surrounded by family, by anyone for that matter, seemed incredibly claustrophobic. I needed the outdoors and solitude. I'd never gone on a hike in my life. I'd grown up hunting and camping in the natural state, so I was around the wilderness. But starting at point A and walking to point B never really interested me. Not until now, anyway. On many of my drives home, down a scenic Highway 23, or the Pig Trail as we referred to it, I'd seen the crossing for the Ozark Highland Hiking Trail, but never had gone and given it a second thought. Now, however, it was almost audibly calling my name. A few days earlier, I bought a map of the Ozarks, which showed several different hiking trails. This was way before GPS and smartphones, and I plotted my course. The plan was to drop my car off at the Pig Trail, crossing and have my roommate take me further up the trail on his way home. It wasn't too far out of his way, so he didn't mind. Like I said, we didn't have GPS or phones, but I was a 19-year-old guy in great shape and going to live forever, so I never gave it a second thought. In my mind, all I needed was my map, a compass, some food, water, tent, and a sleeping bag, and I was set. I couldn't wait to get out into the open air, away from school and away from everybody. So, on Saturday morning we left the dorms around 10 o'clock, deposited my car on 23, and I was at my starting point, a couple miles north of the little town of Ozark, sometime before noon. It was a brisk and beautiful fall day in the Ozark Mountains, and life was good again. The total expedition looked to be around 25 miles, so I figured I'd take it 3 days max. But I wasn't in any hurry. I had plenty of food, and there were multiple creeks along the way, so if it took the entire week, well, it wouldn't bother me one bit. The first day was great. I took it real slow, making my way around and down a mountain towards this valley. It was just what I needed. Everything was perfect right up until about 30 minutes after making camp. I'd stopped at the base of the valley where the trail crossed the Little Mulberry Creek. It was a great spot. I built a small fire and set my tent. I just settled back and enjoyed the sunset when a group of 4 guys had arrived and made camp about 50 yards away. It wasn't too bad until they turned on their CD player. Really? Why would you come out into nature only to turn on your stereo? After about the 3rd time through Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry Be Happy, I was ready to pull my hair out. The next morning, I was up and out before my neighbors began to stir. I didn't want to run the risk of anywhere being near them while I hiked. Again, it was another wonderful day. The beauty of the Ozarks at the time of year is something to see. They're not really mountains per se, more like giant rolling tree-covered hills. When the leaves change and fall, it's simply spectacular. By the time I reached my next planned campsite, Indian Creek, it was getting close to dusk. I could have walked a little further, But again, I wasn't in any hurry to get back, and I'd much rather be near water overnight. I surveyed the surroundings and picked a spot, but recalling the previous night's futility, I looked up the creek. I didn't want to run the risk of a repeat, if those guys were still on the trail anyway. So, I decided to follow it north, away from the trail. I picked up my backpack and started walking at a brisker pace. I wanted to get as far out of earshot as possible before sunset. I guessed I'd gone about 2.5 miles north before finding a nice cozy spot near the creek. Being in another valley, the sun was already behind the mountain, but I still had enough light to finish camp. By the time the fire was going good, the stars were shining bright in a cloudless sky, framing a perfectly full moon. The night was glorious. It seemed late, but couldn't have been much past 10 p.m. when I gave in to drowsiness and crawled inside the tent. I'm not sure what time I stirred, but the fire was nothing more than a few glowing embers, so it must have been several hours later. It wasn't anything specific that woke me, nothing aside from the absolute stillness of the night. It had been somewhat breezy before turning in, with the crickets loudly chirping. Now, nothing. Even the trickling creek directly outside seemed muted. This was the first moment I can recall a bit of uneasiness creeping over me. My stomach tingled with a slight touch of anxiety as I poked my head out of the tent. It was so quiet and bright. Without the fire illuminating camp, the moon and stars could bathe the creek bed in their light. I crawled the rest of the way out and sat up and listened. Ever so faintly, further north I could just barely make it out. A baby? Crying? Out here? Could there be a house somewhere, way out here? Maybe another family of hikers? It seemed unlikely, and sounds like they could travel forever here. Maybe it was further than I thought. I sat and listened. Surely, if it was a house nearby, the baby's mother would come and comfort the child. The crying continued, growing more and more distinct. Now, I'd worked the night shift, buffing floors at the local hospital, and I'd been up in the labor and delivery ward. I knew what it sounded like when a baby was hungry or fussy, and I knew what it sounded like when they stuck one of them with a needle. It's a distinctly different sound of crying. This was a needle-sticking cry. Something was not right. I've read studies about the sound of a baby crying does to someone, even to dogs and cats. It unleashes this primal need, for lack of a better phrase, do something about it. I didn't know about that then, but looking back now, I wish I did. Instinct were pulling me to respond. Gradually, I rose and grabbed my flashlight. I quickly discovered I could see better with the light on, so I attached the strap to my belt loop and continued north. The crying grew louder and more urgent the further I went. I was getting close. The creek disappeared around the bend to the right, but I could tell I was now standing between the water and the baby. I could see a slight opening into the brush that looked like an old pathway. If not for the cries from the baby, I would easily assume it was just another game trail. I summoned all the courage I could muster and plowed ahead through the brush. With each step I took, my sense of trepidation grew. Just as I started to reach for my light, the brush around me began to open up. Desperate cries pounded in my head as I jogged faster towards the opening up ahead. When I broke through, I was standing at the edge of a small clearing. The moonlight revealed a small, rugged shack about 40 yards ahead on the opposite side. It had a single-room cabin with a stone chimney on the left rusted tin roof as a cover. Its lone, front-facing window, in the air, hung the stench of a hard-grain alcohol and hate. I shuddered. About halfway between the shack and me, off to the right sat an old water well and looked even older than the house. Its walls were made of stone. There were what appeared to be old railroad ties on either side supporting the wooden spool over the shaft. A hand crank stuck out from its side, and an old rope wrapped the spool, but there was no bucket at its end. The well did not appear to have been used in a very long time. Cries jolted me back into the moment. The thought of approaching that shack flooded me in absolute terror. Something evil was inside that house, but the baby's shriek intensified and I willed my feet onward. I had taken only a few steps when the realization hit me with a lead weight. The screaming wasn't coming from the shack. It echoed up from the depths of that well. Suddenly, a woman burst through the cabin door, sending me to my knees in fright. Her tattered and dingy plaid dress billowed behind as her sprint towards the crying infant. "Lily Mae!" Her shrieks pierced my ears. She continued to wail until she reached the well. Again, she sobbed, "Lily Mae!" Now, into its mouth. I somehow managed to find my feet with trembling legs. I tried my best as I could to move ahead. I staggered towards her, but by the time I got there, she already wrapped the rope around her waist and tied it off. "Ma'am!" I shouted. "Ma'am, let me!" But she was over the edge before I could stop her. The wooden spool squealed and shook as she descended. Looking down into the shaft, all I could see was a few feet of rope and black nothingness. The crying was even more amplified as I stood directly above. Then the screeching spool by my head abruptly stopped. "Ma'am, I'll pull you out. Just let me know when you're—" A door slammed from behind, freezing me in place. The stench of moonshine reeked in the air and overwhelmed me. I turned to look, and there he stood on the porch. I tried to move, to yell out in fear, but my body betrayed me and didn't budge. He was a large man, wearing an old worn-out sweat-stained coveralls, which, even in the midday sun, shone bright, the original color of which could not have been known. His boots and hat matched the dirty brown look. Moonlight glistened off his sweaty, unshaven face while greasy streaks of dirt pooled into wrinkles around his neck. My attention was drawn down to what he held in his right hand, an old, well-worn wooden hatchet. I still couldn't move a muscle, as he methodically stepped off the porch and moved towards the well, towards me. With each deliberate step he took, the air pressure surrounding me dropped. It was like I was in a vacuum, with all the air being sucked out, replaced with hate. The cries from below grew louder as if they were inside my very head. I struggled to breathe, but the stink of sweat and liquor choked my lungs. He was mere feet from me now. As he raised the hatchet high in the air, I resigned myself to my fate. This was the end. As the hatchet came down, instinct overcame terror and I dropped to all fours. The sound of iron on wood echoed throughout the valley. I looked up. He towered over me, arm and hand still attached to the hatchet, attached to the spool. In one blow, he'd driven the tool deep into the wood, severing the rope and sending it deep into the bowels of the earth. The baby's cries had diminished now in what I can only guess the comforting arms of her mother, only to be replaced by the mother's screams of desperation. The man, never acknowledging my presence, turned back towards the shack and moved away at the same pace in which he had came. My eyes followed as he went, but he softly faded away before his first foot hit the porch. Instantly, I became aware of my labored breath, aware of the sound of my heart resounding in my head. Sweat dripped from my nose as I was drenched. I looked back again, and the shack was gone. Only a solitary stone fireplace stood there now. I struggled to my feet to find the well was different too. The wooden beams and wench was now gone, and a rusty metal lid sealed off the top. I could still hear the faint sobs from the mother beneath the steel sarcophagus, but even that faded now. Then, silence. A gentle breeze touched my face for the first time in what seemed ages. and I was suddenly cold. The trees rustled away as a gust of wind rustled through the valley, breathing life back into the forest. A single cricket chirped back to life, signaling the rest that it was okay to sing again. I wasn't the only witness that night. They'd seen it too. I'm not sure how long it took me to stumble back to my camp, but by the time I sat down, the sun was just breaking over the crest of the valley. I must have sat there shaking for at least another hour. I was back to my car before following sunset, and when I turned onto the highway, I headed south, for home. It was my only option now. I wanted to see my mother, and tell her I was sorry. If you search the internet for Ghost Mountain, Arkansas, you'll find the story of how on a moonlit night in the 1930s, a drunken man threw his sick child into a well. You'll read that after his hysterical wife went in after it, he cut the rope she used and left them there to die. How on certain nights, when the moon's full, you can still hear the mother's screams and the cries from that baby emanating from the belly of the well. Now mind you, the internet won't give an exact location. It only speaks in generalities and tells you to talk to the locals. The problem is, they're not looking in the right place. I've visited that well many nights in my sweat-soaked dreams, heard that mother scream, seen that terrible man. I'll never be rid of them. I've since married and divorced. I've told my wife weeks into our relationship I've never wanted children, and said she was okay with that. She lied. Years later she begged. She asked, "Why won't you have children? I've seen you with them. You're great. You'd be a great father." I'd answer, No, never. I told you from the beginning I do not want children. I don't like them." That was also a lie. I love children. I desperately want one of my own. The simple truth of the matter is I can't. The crying child inside my head that wakes me in the middle of the night is bad enough. I think a real one, night after night, will push me over sanity's edge, will push my mind back into that night, back to the bottom of that well, never again to see the light of day.